Dear friends, good evening. It's a distinctive pleasure to greet you at this Gaidar Forum session that is themed how the world was coping with the crisis of 2020. A very relevant topic, isn't it? The world has indeed encountered a unique and unprecedented event. The scope of the economic slump was without a precedent in the history. Yes, the situation is growing more stable now, and yet it's still unclear for how long this crisis is with us to stay. It is unclear what the ultimate impact of the crisis would be upon the economy, upon the societies. And we are about to discuss these consequences with two economists in high esteem. I think they need no introduction at all, and yet it's my distinctive pleasure to introduce them. Our first guest is Adam Tooze, professor of history at Columbia University, and Barry Eichengreen, professor of economics and political science in the University of California, Berkeley. They are members of the academia in high esteem. They are great dialogue partners, and it would be a distinctive pleasure for me to discuss the situation around us in the context of the global economy. Good evening, Barry. Good evening, Adam. I think it's a good morning for you, rather, given the differences of time zones. We are speaking in a virtual format, each of us from home or from work, so I hope it would not be a nuisance for the quality of our conversation. Barry, I want to address the first question to you. How do you assess the state of play in the world economically after this pandemic? Many issues that the governments across the world had to address in 2020 did not emerge in 2020. Many of them matters of economic policy, the debt burden, monetary policy issues, and many others, ranging from healthcare to economy at large, emerged long before that. We were aware of many of those, but they became more salient in 2020, and the pandemic has proven that they are indeed serious issues. So the question is, was the world ready for what had happened? For instance, we have witnessed something. We have witnessed that the humanitarian aspect, the value of human life, loomed large, and the reasoning of many governments. It was indeed possible that a pandemic of a different disease with a greater rate of morbidity and mortality would be viewed completely differently today. Barry, I want to give the floor to you and ask you this question. What do you think the state of play today after the pandemic?
Thank you, Pavel. So your question in passing was the world ready for the pandemic? And I'd be happy to give a one-word answer. It's clear that we were not prepared for what was coming. And I think perhaps the economic historians amongst us bear some responsibility for that. I've been teaching 20th century economic history for many years, and I never taught the 1918-1919 flu pandemic. It's not central to the literature that we all know and teach. And I think in part that's because it's very hard to trace the economic consequences of that earlier pandemic that erupted while World War I was still raging, that continued during the demobilization period, all of which makes it difficult to identify the effects of the pandemic. So we skipped it, or everyone I know basically skipped it. And the historical insight that we're now getting from recent studies of that earlier pandemic, I think is quite useful. So we could have prepared better. In terms of where we go from here, I would just say the virus will largely determine the economic developments going forward. The economic policy response, narrowly defined, has been good, but broadly defined, to include public health policy, has been much more problematic. And I think many people's view that with the arrival of vaccines, we only have to get them into people's arms and the rest will be history. As they say, I think those people are shutting the door on the pandemic too quickly.
Yes, I think we can agree to this, especially if we believe that everyone is fighting the past wars, and each crisis is always a surprise to some extent. And I completely coincide with you that the Spanish flu epidemic was a similar event, and yet it was a long time ago and it was poorly explored. So the economic agents were different, the governments were different. So it would be difficult for us today to undergird our decisions with the experiences from back then. Adam, what do you think? Was it possible to meet this pandemic better prepared? What could have been done in the previous 10 years, the 10 years that elapsed since the time of the last global crisis, to avoid this catastrophe?
Well, thank you very much, Pavel, for the question. It's a pleasure to be here with you, and I wish very much that we could be in Moscow to have this conversation. I think one of the ironies, one of the puzzling things about our experience of the pandemic so far is that it was, after all, anticipated. So Barry's absolutely right that I think economic historians, especially those of us like he and I who've worked on the early 20th century, tended to systematically underestimate the importance of the Spanish flu. But it would not be fair to the large group of technocrats globally and epidemiologists and virologists, public health professionals, who since the 1980s have been consistently warning of precisely the sort of scenario that we have faced. One of the questions we have to ask, I think, is why their warnings did not receive the sort of salience that they clearly deserved, and why in the, as it were, portfolio of worries that we did take seriously, this was so much further down the list than it needed to be. And whilst recognizing that there are, after all, teams of highly motivated, highly skilled professionals who were working on this problem, and furthermore had identified it, I think the politics of AIDS is quite important here. The last 20 years, powerful coalitions of NGOs, public health trusts, pharma, one should not discount the role of the industry itself, and national governments, including the American and the British government, have been working hard, in fact, to widen the vaccine pipeline and to accelerate it. And another way of looking at this year is, yes, COVID blindsided us, but this is also the year in which the second person in the world has been, we think, cured of AIDS. It's the year in which Africa was declared free of wild polio. And it's the year in which the portfolio of candidate vaccines for several very important diseases, notably malaria, is in fact on the cusp, we think, of producing potential breakthrough vaccines. So I think we need to relativize, as it were, what has no doubt been a shambles in much of the world in our dealings with this particular virus, and recognize the fact that our ability to move as quickly as we have towards a vaccine, as qualified as that triumph may be, is itself significant of change which has been ongoing and which is owed to the relentless work of very dedicated professionals in this field over the last couple of years, who, and let's come now to the sad part, were to a very considerable extent betrayed and let down by national governments and national government decision-making in the crucial months earlier this year. And we can go into the details of the arguments and the post-mortems country by country, but I think that misses the point in a sense that that failure was quite collective, in part because it was just simply impossible to imagine the steps that would have been necessary. You know, in retrospect, it's clear we just should have shut all the major international airports in February. But to have suggested that would have been extraordinarily difficult to actually back with political judgment. There are a handful of countries that come out of this experience looking good. And the most leading example is, of course, China. And the question, of course, is whether China's regime is sui generis, whether any lessons follow from China's apparent ability to contain what was a major outbreak at the provincial and regional level, which is the size of a European country, within a much bigger entity. And I think now that those are the hard questions that we're going to be facing going forward. The year as a whole does not leave me, I agree with Barry A, that the narrow economic policy response was in fact, remarkably fit for purpose. But also the rapidity with which the vaccine pipeline has been able to be accelerated is, after all, a remarkable, unprecedented achievement. And if we're thinking about how we go forward, it's clear, I think, that we need to widen that, amplify that, speed it up, build the databases that enable us to respond even more quickly in future. The harder problem is, as it were, building the social capacity, the social collective self-discipline, the political intelligence to deal with a problem like this. And that, I think, that's a tough nut. That is really, as Max Weber would have said, the boring of hard boards. It's a brutally difficult problem to face.
Adam, I completely agree with you that the scope of the governmental support was unprecedented. And in its scale, in its scope, in its depth, if we look back in retrospect, we can also take note of the speed, of the pace of this response. So what do you think, what caused the governments to respond so quickly? Was it the sense of the imminent danger, perhaps the feeling that this is a really dangerous thing? Is it an institutional change that was a long time coming? Or was it the crisis of 2008, 2009, when we thought that any hesitation might be dangerous? What do you think was it? What is your assessment? What instilled the sense of urgency to the governments? Adam?
I think part of the urgency came from the fact that this was unlike other crises in that it was, if not, I'm hesitant to say government ordered, because in so many cases the evidence in fact suggests that the population was itself moving to protect itself. But we're not dealing with a conventional economic crisis around which there are an entire politics of moral hazard, interest group argument. This was recognized as a new shock, recognized as it were, a voluntary move to self-protect and to protect the most vulnerable in society, backed by the authority of government. And so it seemed, I think, everywhere as though there was a responsibility on the public purse to support that collective solidaristic action. The fact that moral hazard arguments didn't play an important role was quite significant. One could then look case by case, I think, at the politics at a national level of the responses. It's very striking, I think, how large the action has been in certain emerging market economies. Brazil, for instance, is a truly stunning case of a middle-income country mobilizing 10% of GDP to back a highly redistributive support program for the poorest informal workers in that society. That's a striking logic to have emerged out of the interplay of congressional politics and Bolsonaro's populism. All the while, the president is denying the significance of the epidemic. In Europe, I think we can speak of a learning process. The Europeans do not want to go back to the shambles of the Eurozone crisis that both Barry and I have been very critical of them about. It didn't happen instantly. There was a rearguard action by conservatives there as well, but they got there within the space of months rather than years that it took during the Eurozone crisis the first time round. In the American case, I think you have to say that really, on the one hand, it was indeed the sense of acute crisis in March, the spiraling upwards of unemployment numbers that was very shocking to everyone, I think, in American society. But there is also a hard-nosed political calculation here, which is that it was a Republican president in the White House. And I am not confident that I would be able to predict the response of the GOP, the Republican Party, in the face of that crisis if it had been a Democrat at that moment. We will see how that politics plays out in this year. So I think a general sense of a novel type of crisis requiring a novel type of response, and then, as it were, regionally specific, nationally specific politics that shaped the logic of that reaction.
If I can add real briefly, I do think it's important to remember, Adam did remind us how frightening the drop in output and employment was in the first couple of months when we shut down. I do think there was learning from the global financial crisis that deficit spending and quantitative easing under those circumstances do not immediately produce runaway inflation. That was an important learning experience. And then, as Adam said, it's really been striking to see how differently the German government has responded with stimulus this time, because the moral hazard concerns that normally restrain it were not present.
Indeed, and we continue with what you have said. The initial figures of the drop of growing unemployment and shrinking of GDP, they were indeed shocking. But as the measures, support measures were being implemented, as well as fiscal system stimulus, as well as other stimulus were taking, and we saw the improvement in the outlook throughout the year. And according to the latest data, the shrinking is indeed very serious. I mean, the shrinking of the GDP for the majority of the countries, but still it's not as hard, as catastrophic as we saw it at the beginning of the year when the pandemic was just unrolling. And the measures being undertaken by many countries were indeed very different, but they had certain features in common. What do you think? As I said, the epidemic is not yet over. We're not out of the woods yet. But as for now, Barry, what do you think? What are the common features in the successful measures? What turned out to be efficient and what not?
I would echo what you said, Pavel, that it's too early to draw definitive conclusions. We're having another spike of the virus in the United States and many other places, and that will be negative for economic activity. So if unemployment has come back down, it can turn around now and go right back up if people are reluctant to go out, if they're reluctant to go to work, if they're reluctant to go to the store, as they should be for the moment. The common feature is monetary and fiscal stimulus. And as Adam said, it's striking to note that many emerging markets have been able to use both monetary and fiscal policy in a countercyclical way, unlike what they've been able to do in the past. And the relevant question here, I do not have an answer, is whether that has been possible because they have built credibility over time, enabling their central banks to engage in easing in difficult times, or whether they've been aided by the Fed, which brought interest rates down to zero, and by investors who have nowhere else to park their money other than in emerging markets where yields are still positive, unlike in the advanced country world. I think the other thing we will have to think about is this policy response has been designed to keep workers attached to their current employers. At some point, a significant fraction of those current employers are going to disappear because business travel will downsize permanently, and brick and mortar retail will downsize permanently. At what point do you modify those policies so that workers move into alternative employment?
Да, интересно, что вы отметили контрциклическую политику.
Yes, it's interesting that you mentioned the policy of the developing countries. It is indeed what happened in Russia. Throughout the previous crisis, the central bank had to increase the interest rate in order to fight the depreciation of the currency and the outflow of the capital. And this year, like many other developing countries, our central bank could ease its monetary policy quite sharply. And though there was some depreciation and increase in inflation, that could not be compared with the previous times. You said that it's very hard to separate the prudential macro policy of the previous years and the role that's been played by the Fed stimulus and other major central banks. But from your experience, from certain historical lessons, did the inflation targeting play a role that was introduced throughout the recent years in the emerging markets? Maybe the budget rule, because many countries started to be more cautious in their fiscal policy. Maybe that also played a role. What do you think, considering your experience and expertise? How would you compare that?
Well, I would reiterate, I think there is an alternative or a complementary story, which is that very unusual financial conditions in the advanced country world, partly engineered by the Fed and partly the result of the extraordinarily low level of interest rates before the crisis, has led to this tsunami of capital flowing toward emerging markets rather than away from them. So there are push and pull stories about capital flows, and I think they're both at work here.
Thank you, Adam. What do you think? Maybe you would be more definitive in your response to that.
Well, I actually think of them as linked together, because it seems to me that if you think about the emerging markets policy regime, which has now been identified by both the IMF in this integrated framework model they have and by the BIS in its annual report last year, you can see the international financial agencies cogitating about what they see as, I think the BIS referred to it as practice moving ahead of theory. And what they diagnose, I think, is a long learning experience over the course of a generation, really since the late 1990s crises, of which, of course, Asia and Russia were the absolute heart of those, but you see this in Turkey as well. The development on the part of substantial emerging markets of a whole series of new policy instruments that are designed to hedge the risks of financial integration. Of course, they are not ultimately a guarantee of sovereignty or autonomy, but they buy you time, they enable you to shift risk, they buy you some space. And that could be strategic space. I mean, Putin's Russia is the classic instance of this. You can ride out a very hostile international environment if you have $500 billion in foreign exchange reserves and very tight control over the balance sheets of certain big key actors. It's macroprudentialism by a different name, the management of the major private balance sheets in the Russian case. But that innovation in terms of the toolkit of emerging market, as it were, managed autonomy within the global financial system was hugely accelerated by the first wave of QE. If you think about Brazil, for instance, their range of innovations set in when they started complaining about too much money moving from the United States up to the famous taper tantrum of 2013 and then the aftermath. So I think what we're seeing here, I'm not going to be any more decisive than Barry, you're not going to pin me down on that, but I would say that the two things are interconnected in a kind of dialectic in which substantial EM players have to acquire for themselves a capacity to deal with flows which we can't any longer naturalize, right? No one can pretend that the $1 trillion that churn in and out of Western central metropolitan financial markets in a world of QE are a force of nature to which everyone somehow has to submit and then play by the rules, right? If the major central banks in Europe, Japan, and the United States are engaged in the kind of extraordinary seat of the pants improvisation they are, well, why should anyone else play by determined rules? Everyone else has to improvise too. And we've been in a situation this year, after all, in which, as it were, the conservative central bank in the world has been the People's Bank of China. I mean, if you wanted to go somewhere to earn like a 2.5%, 3% yield, plus an exchange rate premium, you went to China. And the Chinese have made hay with this, right? I mean, they position themselves in their own internal dialogues as the guardians of a conservative, sensible central banking against the degenerate model that we see emerging in the West. They even had an argument about QE and bond purchases, and in very German terms decided, no, that was against the rules, they wouldn't do that. Then they found some other way of doing it by way of the balance sheets of policy banks. But we're in the black and white world of the Washington consensus has really dissolved, I think, into a kind of fantastically interesting, from a historian, from a detached observer's point of view, fantastically interesting milieu and mixture, ecosystem of different improvised responses.
Да, то, что вы говорите, на самом деле очень интересно.
What you're saying is very interesting,
Действительно, вот эта парадигма
because indeed this paradigm of a Washington consensus
начала подвергаться сомнениям
it started
еще
to
и
be
до вот этого кризиса.
doubted even before the crisis.
И подвергаться таким
It was being
многочисленным
questioned
вызовам и испытаниям.
and being
Но,
challenged.
действительно, все больше популярность, все больше распространение
Ever more
получают
popular
инфляционные
is
меры.
becoming
И возникают
the
даже
inflationary measures, unconventional
условно
measures
говоря, теории
that have to do with the
жанра
theory of
да, modern monetary theory,
more than one true theory and MMMT and so on. And with that comes the question, wouldn't we have to pay the price sooner or later for those stimulus, for that easing policy? You know, the discussion is taking place whether all this would lead to inflation. Would the world come across the next period of stagflation? What do you think? Would it be different this time? Or certain negative long-term impact of this easing policy would come at a certain point? Barry?
We've all been reminded of the importance of R minus G by this crisis. We have to think not only about the price that has to be paid on all that debt that we've accumulated as a result of this policy response, but also what it implies for economic growth. So we look to it looks like we remain in the happy situation where the growth rates of most of our economies exceed the interest rate on our debt. So the question going forward, obviously, is how long that will remain the case. We don't know, because we don't know what the private sector spending response to the pandemic will be in the longer term. There are two views out there. One is that it will be the roaring 20s, just like after the Spanish flu, and people will be spending hand over fist. That will be inflationary, interest rates will rise, and debt management will become more difficult. There's a second view, however, that many people have been reminded by the experience of the pandemic that their precautionary savings are inadequate. American families unable to put food on the table for their children. So the higher personal savings rates we saw over the summer could persist. And in that scenario, spending remains weak. Government budget deficits are necessary to sustain economic growth. Interest rates don't go up. Inflation doesn't rise. And debt management remains easy. We don't know enough about psychology and neurology and how people's outlooks are going to be affected in the long run by the experience of the pandemic. Again, I think both scenarios are plausible and consistent, and it's too early to know how people will respond.
Да, к сожалению, мы еще находимся, что называется, в середине.
Oh yes, we are very much in the middle, in the thick of the pandemic, and the recovery is still a long time coming. So maybe 20, 30 years from now, we'll be able to definitively say whether we were right or wrong. And as I speak to the towering figures as you are, well, what do you think? if we look at the past cases, do you think that this time around the response, the state response, was more efficient or less efficient than in the past? If we try to give a score to the response of the state response to this crisis and the crisis of Spanish flu, what would be your score, Adam? Or Barry, if you want to be the first.
I mean, the most striking thing. I mean, I thought Barry was very. It was a great point that Barry made at the beginning about our collective failure as economic historians to think about the Spanish flu. But I would say in our defense, that having spent quite a lot of time in the archive, the political archive of the Spanish flu moment, I'm pretty confident that I haven't missed an important meeting of heads of government in which they discussed the Spanish flu. There wasn't, as far as I'm aware, and it's possible that this is out there to be found in the archive, anything like the globally coordinated collective response that we have seen this time. And the most dramatic difference is the response in the places where we think most of the people died in the Spanish flu. So the population that suffered worst, we think, in the Spanish flu is the population of India, of British-administered India, of the British Empire in India. And statistics are vague, but we think that that's where most people died. And at the time, it doesn't seem to have been the case there was any, as it were, collective imperial response to this disaster that was happening in what was, after all, the key to the British Empire as a whole. And it fell under the table along with the famines that also struck India under British rule. The difference this time around is extraordinary. Obviously, one may criticize, and many people have, the details of Modi's response to the crisis in Italy. And there is an argument to be had there that people that know the Indian scene much better than I do should have. It may have not been the appropriate response, but the fundamental difference is that no life was too cheap. Everyone wanted to respond in March. Everyone claimed that for them too, this was a crisis to which they, as a national government, had a responsibility to respond. And that is, in that form, and this kind of comprehensiveness, unprecedented in history. So we don't really have anything to compare ourselves to. Once we get into the narrow details of economic policy, like Barry started by saying, I think we come out reasonably well. The collective experience, is the beginning of a steep learning curve that we all clearly now need to be on, because there are going to be more of these. That's one thing we know for pretty much certain. And so we need urgently to learn. But I would shield us against comparisons with Spanish flu, because I just don't see the equivalence.
Well, probably I'm not even... what if we compare it not to the Spanish flu, but to the grand-scale crises of the past, like the crisis of 2008, 2009? I know that the origin was completely different, but the sheer scale of it, I think, was comparable. We can stick it against the current corona crisis. Back then, the attitude of the governments across the world was a bit different. So my impression was that it's different this time around. You mentioned the global agenda, that the countries today are actually ready to discuss, to come together and to try to elaborate some kind of a collective response, which probably shows us a more globalized world, a more open world, which was gradually built over the last decades. So I want to ask Barry this question. Do you think that the pandemic will be the beginning of a new deglobalization process, that the supply chains will be somehow disrupted, that the flow of goods will be disrupted? Do you think it's possible?
I'm going to give my grades for the policy response first and then address your question. So I think about the policy responses involving two stages: recognition and execution. think the recognition on all fronts was good, as Adam said. I think the execution was good on the monetary and fiscal fronts and poor on the public health front. If I look at the chaotic situation in the United States, I'm not reassured. Beyond that, on globalization, I have been struck by how resilient supply chains and globalization has been. Financial globalization is still working unimpeded because finance can flow across borders without us actually having to shake hands. Everyone says that just-in-time inventory and supply chain practices will give way to just-in-case practices where there'll be more diversification and shorter supply chains. And I think people who say that are right. But my bottom line would be that the period of hyperglobalization, when trade flows grew more quickly than the global economy because of containerization, air freight, and China, that period is probably over, but there's no reason why trade and global GDP can't rise in tandem. The part I'm waiting for, of course, is to see whether business travel and holiday travel to different countries recovers. I certainly hope so.
Ну, вообще, если ставить этот вопрос в более широкий контекст, то
Well, if we put the question more broadly and look at the broader picture, I cannot but ask one question: how the pandemic will affect the economic development. I'm not just talking about the job figures or GDP growth, but in general, there are 2 points of view, basically, 2 schools of thought. First one is that we go back to the old normal. We'll go back to the old status quo, to the way it was, as it happened with previous epidemics and other healthcare crises. The second school of thought is that the world will never be the same again. It has already changed beyond recognition, and we are entering the new reality. We will live in this new virtual normal. The IT will be boosted beyond recognition. The IT share in the economy will grow. So I know that it would be premature, perhaps, to draw definitive conclusions, but what are the key changes in the economic models that you see right now?
I think it's clear that the pandemic has led to more experimentation and will result in the wider use of robotics and AI and so forth in a variety of sectors, which is going to be both good and bad. It's going to be good for productivity growth. So the computers and robots will become evident in the GDP statistics finally, but it'll be bad for less skilled workers. Home healthcare workers will be replaced by home healthcare robots, already happening in Japan. And we're going to see lots of examples of that. So there are going to be severe social strains that will accentuate the inequality and feeling of economic grievance among people who are going to find themselves newly competing with robotics. And we need to think about what to do about that.
Адам, а вы как считаете? Вы являетесь сторонником
Adam, and what do you think?
того, что мы вернемся к
Which school of thought do you belong to? Do you think that we will go back to old normal, or we will change beyond recognition? I mean, economically speaking, would it be the old normal or the new normal? Or perhaps there have already been some irreversible changes that will affect the economy?
I think I agree, broadly speaking, with Barry that the virus has the effect of accelerating existing processes of change on the front of inequality, on the renegotiation of the division of labor, automation. I think all of those things. The pace at which Chinese GDP is likely to overtake that of the major Western economies, we think it's been brought forward by maybe 5 years, that date, till the late 2020s. The major legacy is going to be on the financial side. I mean, we have seen a historic shock to the debt stock, and that changes the parameters. And there is a benign scenario that Barry was laying out for us earlier on, in which, though that stock is there, it doesn't have much impact on the flows, if you like, because interest rates remain very low. If that were to shift, it would change the game completely. It would create extraordinary distributional questions then. And I think that's, as it were, one of the legacies, is that we will forever have to deal, as it were, with the pending political problem, the what if type political problem that hangs over us when debt levels go to much higher shares of GDP. It need not necessarily be the cause of an immediate crisis, but it changes the parameters because it makes it very important to rule out certain scenarios. There are certain places we need not to go under those circumstances. That changes the central bank policy equation, the reaction function, I think most people would believe. I do think probably at the level of the discourse of economic policy, and we see that in notable cases in the scene. There's an important op-ed being published in the Financial Times in the last 24 hours by the epitome of the Clinton era, Robert Rubin, Peter Orszag, Joe Stiglitz kind of class of American economists, insisting that we need to rethink fiscal policy. So at the level of discourse, at the level of policy argument, I think 2020 may indeed turn out to be a turning point. It's going to be pretty hard to get back to the years before. So I think in that sense, it's opened the door to further change. And the question really is, what are the politics, right? What are the coalitions of key actors that could substantially shift this? Barry wrote brilliantly about the indecisive nature of the 2008 crisis, in part precisely because the immediate stabilization efforts worked. We didn't get the desperate coalition of action that we had in the 1930s. And I think it'll be interesting to see how the political economy of this works out. At the global level, the shift is dramatic and it's happening. And I think a whole series of very big questions arise for American politics and its ability to digest that fact. I mean, the multipolarity, the wider ramifications of the domestic chaos that Barry politely hinted at, after all, do need to be worked out in the minds of America's policymakers themselves, and specifically in the minds of the Biden team.
Oh yes, and speaking of the matters of political economy, I wanted to ask Barry, what do you think would be the impact of pandemic on the rise of populism globally? Because from the one hand, we see the disillusionment of people across the world, and their disappointment with the politicians. But from the other hand, this desperate economic situation may also be a fertile ground for populism. What do you think about it?
Pavel, you gave on the one hand, on the other hand answer that feels natural to an economist. Styles of politics, politicians that responded poorly to the pandemic are going to be discredited, and populist leaders responded poorly because they denigrate the experts who were needed in order to mount a competent policy response. Populist politicians denigrate the systems, the deep state, we call it sometimes in the United States, that was necessary for a competent policy response. That's a factor in why Donald Trump lost the election. On the other hand, my own research shows that this kind of experience, with my co-authors, we looked at 34 epidemics in the past. Exposure to this kind of experience reduces individuals' confidence, trust in government, in leaders, and in elections. So I'll emphasize that last one. We published the research last summer. Who would have ever guessed that there would have been high controversy about the validity of an election in the midst of a pandemic? That's what past epidemics have done globally. And that lack of trust is fertile ground for non-mainstream, anti-system politicians. So I don't I think even where populists are out of power, as they're about to be in the United States, they're not going to disappear from the political scene, and their supporters are not going to modify their views.
Спасибо, Адам, Барри.
Adam, Barry, thank you. This 45 minutes quickly came to a close, came to an end, and I'm very grateful for your inputs and for your participation in the GAIDAR forum. And I really hope that I'll see you offline and personally in the next year's iteration, perhaps even personally. It was a great pleasure. Thank you.